If you can get past the Sundance hype and the commodification of the term indie, you can see that the independent film revolution began decades earlier. And it arguably began with John Cassavetes, a man who The New Yorker said may be the most influential American director in the last half-century. A successful actor, Cassavetes pioneered modern American independent cinema by self-financing and producing films like Shadows, Faces, and Husbands. But his greatest achievement may be the 1974 film A Woman Under the Influence, where he truly bucked the system and took on the role of distributor, along with financier and filmmaker. Starring his wife, Gena Rowlands, and friend Peter Falk, the film was a box office smash, also earning Academy Award nominations for Cassavetes as director and for Gena Rowlands as Best Actress. In celebration of the 50th anniversary of the film's release, we sit down with Jeff Lipsky, a veteran indie sales and marketing executive who got his start in the distribution business working on the release of the film. Jeff went on to introduce American audiences to filmmakers like Jim Jarmusch, Leigh, and Lasse Hallström, founding October Films along the way. But it goes back to Cassavetes and A Woman Under the Influence. Join us for a conversation with this ultimate indie insider and his perspective on this landmark film.
Hi, everybody. My name is Greg Lemley.
And I'm Raphael Sparge.
And welcome inside the Arthouse. Today, our guest is Jeff Lipsky. He's a 50-year veteran of the business, starting as a fan, I guess, but starting as a distributor and then transitioning to a career as an independent filmmaker. We're going to talk about some of the important films that he's worked on over those years.
So, Jeff, your road to become a filmmaker it really touches on sort of every major independent filmmaker of the last 50 years.
Probably that's true. And I'm humbled by all of that.
Yeah. So how did you get to Cassavetes? Where were you when that introduction happened, and how did that happen?
Well, the obsession with John began when I was 17 years old. And I went to see what was then his new movie. I was living in New York. I went to see what was then his new movie, Husbands. And I had already seen probably thousands of films in movie theaters. And this was the first time at the age of 17 that I saw a film. I walked out of the theater in a daze. I probably walked several miles on the streets of Manhattan just thinking about the movie. It blew me away. Even though I was 17, it was about three men who were 40 years old and having to deal with mortality for the first time in their lives. I knew these people. You know, it wasn't like going to see a live-action Disney film. It wasn't like going to see Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein. I knew these people. I had heard people in my life say the things those people were saying, but I had never seen how profoundly those bits of real-life dialogue might affect them afterwards.
Yeah.
And I said, I wanted to make a movie when I was 10 years old. I wrote a 2-part Man from U.N.C.L.E. script. And I still have it, by the way.
Oh, that's
it's called The Haunted House Affair. But so I wanted to make movies when I was 10 years old. This is the first time I said, I want to make movies like this guy, like John Cassavetes.
Right.
I was 17. The following year, his new movie, Minnie and Moskowitz, was coming out. And I was a college film critic, the film critic for my college paper at that time. It was Nassau Community College, and for some bizarre reason, the only major studio that did not invite college critics to their advanced screenings was Universal, and they had Minnie and Moskowitz. But I was determined to see it before it opened, and I can't remember how I managed to get into this Lincoln Center, not the theaters that exist today, but a Lincoln Center Library of the Arts screening. But I did, and I thought I would just go, and then I'd write a review. And I went to see the movie, and I was a little disappointed in the movie.
If we're being honest.
The acting was terrific, but I was a little disappointed. But I walked out of the theater into the lobby, and there was John Cassavetes, and there was Gena Rowlands, and there was Seymour Cassel. That gaze that I fixed on John, it was as if a teenager was looking at the Beatles in 1965.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, I was a decent film critic, but I was a horrible interviewer. But I said to myself, I have to interview him. I have to meet him. And I tracked down his publicist who was there. And I said, does John ever do college interviews? I'd love to interview him. And she said, well, yeah, call me at my office on Monday. And I started badgering her on the phone. I was on Long Island. This was in Manhattan. And the film was going to open in a couple of weeks in New York. And so on a Friday day, beautiful New York December day, it was December 11th, I believe, 1971, I got a call at the office at the college that Eve Siegel's calling you. I got on the phone. She said, you still want to interview John? I said, yes. When? And she said, now. And so I jumped into my car, raced with my stupid little cassette tape recorder while I'm on the Long Island Expressway scribbling banal questions to ask him. And he was staying at the St. Regis Hotel. And I rushed over there. I got the subway went down. I'm never late anywhere. And I got there 5 minutes late. I said, oh, I've blown this opportunity. But I went out. Now, I'm expecting the publicist to answer the door. I knew what door to knock on at the St. Regis Hotel. No publicist. John opens the door. He's on the telephone. He says, come on in, come on in. And so I walk in and I said, do you mind if we tape the interview? He said, no, it's fine. And for 45 minutes, I'm asking him these stupid questions, and he's giving me perfectly decent answers. It was one of the most boring interviews you'd ever heard in your life. And finally, John said, is it okay if we take a break now? I said, oh, yes. And I turned the tape recorder off. And he went and got me a beer, and he had a beer. And we sat for the next 2.5 hours talking about everything under the sun except Minnie and Moskowitz.
Oh, my God.
We were talking about movies. We were talking about women. We were talking about marriage. We were talking about everything in life. And Seymour Cassel, the star of Minnie and Moskowitz, he walked in while this is going on. He grabs a beer and he joins in on the conversation. And finally, he's got to run off to go to an interview or a screening at NYU. And he said, have you written your review yet? And I said, no, not yet. He said, which was true. And he said, when are you going to write it? I said, tomorrow. He said, well, if you write it in the next few days, send me a copy. I'd love to see it. And I walked out of that hotel on cloud nine. Oh, it happened to be that Friday night. I was it was a 6:30 p.m. interview. Well, I was there till almost 10. And all I had to do was walk over. I had been invited to a press screening of a brand new movie that was about to open called The Clockwork Orange. So this all happened on that day. And the next morning, I wrote my review. It was an honest review with accolades for the actors, for Gena and for Seymour. And I sent it to the St. Regis Hotel. And a week later, the movie opened. And it was between fall and spring semesters. And I was at my parents' house sleeping late. And my friend calls me up. He says, have you seen it? I said, see what? He said, the New York Times. I said, no, why? He said, you're in it. I said, what? And in 1971, even on Long Island, you couldn't find the New York Times readily available at every street corner. So I ran out to my car and I went out and I found a copy of the Times. And Universal had taken a half-page ad for Minnie and Moskowitz. And there are quotes from the New York Daily News and Q Magazine and Judith Crist and all these people. And me from Nassau Community College. Knowing what I know about distribution now, Universal must have had a shit fit when he told them to insisted that they put this quote into the ad. And it was about the acting. And so I said to myself, I have to thank him. I didn't even know if he was still in New York at that point. I called the St. Regis. I asked for his room. They put me through. Why are they putting me through? They put me through, and his son, Nick, who I guess was about 11 or 12 years old at the time, answered the phone. And I said, is John there? He said, well, no. Oh, he's on the other phone. I said, well, tell him Jeff Lipsky called to thank him. He said, okay. And he hung up the phone. And I said, no. If he's there, I've got to speak to him. I've got to thank him. So I called back. And this time, Gena, who I hadn't met, had answered the phone. And I said, is John there? She said, who's calling? I said, Jeff Lipsky. And I could hear her say in the background, Jeff Lipsky? And he picks up the phone, and I said, I just wanted to thank you for including my quote. That was so generous. And he said, oh, I thought you wrote a really interesting review. It was very provocative. I really liked it. And he said, listen, why don't you take my address in Los Angeles and let's stay in touch? he said, maybe we could work together on something sometime. I was 18 years old.
Oh my God.
And so for the next year and a half, we were pen pals. I mean, I would write him a letter, he would write me back. But then I kind of let it go because I began working as a theater manager, movie theater manager, and I loved it. I was an usher when I was 16. Well, I'm sorry?
What theater?
It was originally assistant manager at the Roosevelt Field Theater on Long Island, then manager of the Walt Whitman Theater in Huntington on Long Island, then the Allen Theater in New Hyde Park.
Okay.
I mean, I was loving it. I thought this is what I do for the rest of my life. They were paying me real money to manage movie theaters. I loved everything I'd ever done at a movie theater. And I pick up Variety in the summer of '74. And all of a sudden, I look at the film festival selections for the upcoming New York Film Festival, and there's a new film by John Cassavetes called A Woman Under the Influence. I had no idea. I had let the correspondence go. I hadn't been in touch with him in a year and a half. And all of a sudden, there's a new Cassavetes film at the New York Film Festival. The first thing I did was bought a ticket to see it. And the second thing I did was make it my business to find out where he was going to be in New York. I don't know how I did it because I'm not good at these things, but I found out he was going to be at the Wyndham Hotel. And I guess it was a few days before I was going to see the movie. I called the Wyndham Hotel, asked for John Cassavetes' room. They put me through. John answered the phone. I said, I don't know if you still remember me. It's Jeff Lipsky. He said, oh, Jeff, how you doing? What's going on? I told him I was managing movie theaters, and he got all excited because I didn't know that he had no distributor for the film. He was still trying to make a deal with the majors at that point. It was only a week before it was at the New York Film Festival. And he thought, I manage theaters. I must know everything about distribution. I knew diddly about distribution.
That's wild.
And I said, well, listen. He said Sam Shaw, one of his producers, and one of Marilyn Monroe's numerous still photographers, he said, Sam just came in and with the one sheets, and why don't you come over to the hotel? We'll take a look at them. I said, sure. So I race in there, and I saw these. Maybe he had like 4, 5, 6 different versions of the one sheet for the movie. And I said, well, listen, I have 2 days a week off from work. I'll take a bunch of them. I'll have them put up on college campuses. There are all these colleges on Long Island. I'll do that. I'll be happy to do it. Well, what I should have realized was there were a dozen other acolytes in New York at that time, my age, a little older maybe, who also were just swept away in John's work, his films, his talent, his independence, his strident determination to beat the heck out of everybody to prove that there are massive audiences for the kinds of movies he makes. And I went to see it at the New York Film Festival, thought it was a masterpiece. And John had arranged, because he had relationships with a few theater owners in New York and Los Angeles, to open it in New York in November, to open it in Los Angeles in November 2 weeks later, at theaters which were not in big demand by the major studios, but perfectly decent movie theaters. And I began hanging out at his office in New York, volunteering to do anything that he wanted me to do to help him promote the film.
And again, he had no distributor. He was just
he was still trying to make a deal with the majors. And it opened in New York and broke the house record. It also got great reviews. And between that week and 2 weeks later, when it opened in Los Angeles, he said, fuck it, we're going to do it ourselves.
He didn't get an offer even with the reviews, even with the house records?
He never got an absolute firm in-writing offer, and certainly the numbers that were being discussed were not numbers that, tickled his funny bone. And plus,
he's got a hit on his hand. What did
he's had a hit, and even before that, remember, he had this loyalty thing to his friends like nobody I've ever met. And the film was financed equally between he and Peter Falk, who at the time was the biggest star on television from Colombo and had money to burn. But it didn't matter. Peter put up $400,000 or $500,000 of his own money.
Got to get the money back.
John wanted to make sure that money was, returned. And if the studio wasn't going to return it, he was going to find another way to do it. And that was the decision. And between the time it opened in New York and Los Angeles, and John said to me, listen, why don't you just come and work for us? And that was the beginning of I think it was 17-year-long until John passed away.
Unbelievable.
17-year-long friendship. Why was I one of the chosen ones? And I say one because there were other acolytes in my position. People like Sharon Van Iven, who I met the day I began officially working for John, who was an actress. She wanted to be an actress. Before that, just to pay the bills, she was writing those fake letters in Penthouse magazine, stuff like that.
Right.
Anything to get by, to be able to act. And I met her the first day. She was a little older than me, not much, but a little older than me. And I had an instant crush on her. And I said, well, I'm going to make films one day. You're going to be in my first film. Well, 40 years to the day after I said that to her, I cast her in what was my sixth film. But anyway.
That's amazing.
Why me? To this day, I have no idea. John Cassavetes was my film school.
This was...
It's 1974, 1975,
so this
it's rolling into 19...
So your dad at this point was running the theater. He would have been...
Yeah.
But at that time, John didn't know the Laemmles. He knew Ted Mann. And Ted Mann owned this theater, this kind of second choice theater by the majors called the Fox Wilshire at the corner of La Cienega and Wilshire.
Right.
And so that's where A Woman Under the Influence opened and broke the house record. And after it played for about 15 or 20 weeks there, Ted Mann was able to book Tommy there. He would never have been able to open Tommy there had A Woman Under the Influence proved that theater's worth, that theater's potential. But again, the relationship with John and I, that was my film school. It was singular. I began working for him in New York in late 74, but then I moved to Los Angeles to work for him, largely because I actually quit. I mean, what an idiot. One day I came to work in New York, very beginning of February, it was just after the Oscars. A Woman Under the Influence was nominated for Best Director and Best Actress. And to this day, I can never like Ellen Burstyn because Gena Rowlands deserved that Oscar that year. And this Alice Doesn't Something or Other, came out and she won. But it was right after the Oscars, and Al Rubin, John's other producer of Woman Under the Influence, who was running the New York office, suddenly was MIA. He was not in the office. And I said to this young woman, Sharon, any opportunity to talk to Sharon, I said to Sharon, where's Al? And he said, well, he's in L.A. producing John's new movie. I said, what new movie? I had no idea that John had written his new script, Killing of a Chinese Bookie. And because A Woman Under the Influence was making as much money as it was making, which at that time it grossed something like $16 million, which in today's, factoring in inflation, is about $85 million today.
Wow.
And now remember, at that time, there was theatrical and free television. And A Woman Under the Influence was never going to be picked up by NBC for free television. So it was really a strictly theatrical play. But still, the equivalent of $85 million today for an independent film.
Incredible.
That's the other thing. We broke the mold. John broke the mold. There were independent American distributors before John Cassavetes. And there were some very good ones in New York. Don Rugoff, who also owned one of the best theater chains in the country at that time, the New York equivalent of the Laemmle theater chain. There was a company called Continental, which was owned by the other art chain in New York, Walter Reed Theaters, at that time. In fact, Continental had distributed Faces before he made Husbands, successfully, I might add. But all those New York, and there were a couple of LA-based independent distributors, they only did the marketing in New York and Los Angeles, sometimes San Francisco. There was a network, a system of something called sub-distributors in that day and age, located geographically in 31 different areas of the country. The same 31 cities were the major studios maintained 365 days sales offices, because there were no computers. Long-distance calls cost a fortune, and And it was a mom and pop business, even in cities like Dallas or Atlanta. There was also one of the 31 geographic magic cities was Butte, Montana at that time, only because you had to have this handshake deal, day-to-day relationship. You had to know their wives and the kids and all that. And that's who all the independents would go to. And in each of these sales territories, there were independent distributors to handle all the softcore porn, to handle all the international films, the Ingmar Bergman films, the neo-realism films coming out of Italy.
Right.
And the occasional John Cassavetes film. Even pioneers like Shirley Clark, her films never even got that far.
Right.
But John said, why would we pay somebody to do this? We can do it ourselves. A Woman Under the Influence, I believe, became the first independently distributed art film or independent American art film in the United States to do its own distribution coast to coast in all 50 states. Furthermore, A Woman Under the Influence, John will tell you, it's about a blue-collar guy, a blue-collar family. Anybody can identify this. Also, he works for the county, and he works with African Americans. So they're going to go for this movie too. So he was determined. I told him, first of all, he said, this is going to work in drive-ins. And I said to him, well, the company I used to work for, they have a drive-in on Long Island. He said, that's great. Make sure they open it. And it was called the 110 Drive-In in Huntington, New York. And I booked it there in 1974. What was it, about $350 a carload at a drive-in theater? It did $10,000 that week.
Wow.
And so John was right. John was also determined, because of the black potential, to open at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. He wasn't right about that. We booked it there.
Early.
We booked it there. And before, I think minutes after the second matinee started, the film buyer for the Apollo called Al, who had made the booking, and begged him not to make him play it for the rest of the week. Not more than a week. He said, there's nobody in this movie theater. I think there was one person.
Yeah.
So it played there. It's the only independent American art film to ever open at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. It only played for 2 shows, but it
did
happened.
open.
but that's what John did. And John, because people often forget, when he made the permanent transition to filmmaking, he had been the biggest star in Hollywood. He had come off 1967 being nominated for an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for The Dirty Dozen, and the following year was the male star of the biggest grossing film of the year, Rosemary's Baby. And he decided, this is not what I want to do. I don't want to make movies and he loved the people he worked with. Not so much Roman Polanski, but it has nothing to do with what we now are all obsessed with Polanski about. It was that his style of directing and his style of acting was not Roman Polanski's style. And he would come away from that film. The same thing when he did The Fury with the Brian De Palma film. He came back from Israel shooting that film in stitches, laughing. He couldn't stop telling us, Brian kept wanting to put the lens right in my face, and I would start laughing, and he would go nuts, so you wouldn't be able to work for the next 2 hours. But Amy was great, he would say, Amy Irving, and Kirk he had known forever, Kirk Douglas. So we had a blast in Israel. Brian, not so much. But that's the relationship he had with Hollywood producers, Hollywood filmmakers. It just wasn't a style that was going to ever satisfy him as an artist. So getting back to, that was what happened. A Woman Under the Influence. I'm working for him in New York, and then come in one day and Al Rubin's gone. I didn't know he had written this new script, A Woman Under the Influence, and I certainly didn't know that he had decided he was going to make it, and he was already shooting it. And I was upset because I wanted to be a filmmaker. I didn't want to be a distributor, By the way, in the history of humankind, there has never been a little boy, little girl who, when their parents and grandparents asked them, what do you want to be when you grow up, has ever said, I want to be a film distributor. Never has happened. Never will happen. And it was a means to an end. And when I heard that John was doing this, first of all, I said, do we have a script here somewhere? And she said, yeah, here it is. And I took the script home. I read it that night, which was really good. It was actually surprisingly short, not because of improv. It was just a tight script. And but I was very upset. And I called the theater chain I used to work for, and I asked them if they would take me back because I figured this is going to go nowhere for me. And they said yes. So I told Al, who was in Los Angeles producing the film, that I was leaving the company. And Al didn't really care. And I was still living with my parents. And 2 days later, I was home and my mother answered the phone and she said to me, John Cassavetes is calling you. So I took the phone and he said, Jeff, what happened? What did you do? What happened? And I explained, well, I really wanted to be around you. I really wanted to learn whatever I can to, and he said, well, come out here. He said, 48 hours later, everything I owned was in my Plymouth Duster, and I was driving to Los Angeles, where he had arranged that I could stay for a few days. Back then, as you probably remember, finding an apartment in L.A. was easy. You drove down a street you wanted to live on. There was a sign, vacancy.
Right,
you get it. But John still, for 3 days, put me up at his pied-à-terre, which was up at the corner of, where was it? It was La Cienega and Sunset. And he said, and that's it. And so then by day, I was distributing A Woman Under the Influence, because the distribution of that film really went on all the way until the summer of 75. And by night, John was shooting, mostly nights, Killing of a Chinese Bookie. And I could go on the set and I could watch him direct and I could watch him, work with actors from Ben Gazzara to Timothy Carey, to Tim Carey. And that was film school. That became my film school.
So let's take this moment. Let's watch this because we have the opportunity to kind of
Don't worry, it only runs 2 hours, I think, and 20 minutes.
John, will you tell me the time? I'll go get the little chains on your shoes. Big deal? Jeez Louise. But do you have the time, please, because I'm waiting. Hey, listen, you birds, I'm waiting for my kids at school. Do you mind giving me the time? Do ya? What's the matter with you? What's it? Do you have your time? Big... Angela win. Oh, cheater. Oh, 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 oh. Oh, I hope you kids never grow up. Never. You know, I never did anything in my whole life that was anything except I made you guys. I made you and you and you. Oh, my head. What a headache. Woo! Help. Oh, yes. That feels good. Why do hands feel so good? Do you know? Hey, listen. Can I ask you kids a question about me? Can I? When you see me, you know, do you feel, oh, I know her, that's Mom? Or do you ever think of me as dopey or mean or
No, you're smart, you're pretty, you're nervous too.
Thank you. Thank you. Give me your hand here, would you? Hey, look at that. I didn't even know what a big hand you had.
I play ball.
Now, look at these lines. Look at, I had no idea you had all these lines.
Wow.
Ellen Burstyn can't hold the candle.
No, I'm telling you. From the moment it starts, you just feel so intimately connected to the story, to the people on the screen. Every shot just sort of takes you in. There's nothing about it there's no moment where you can take a breath.
Yeah, and I think that you can't give. I mean, in all seriousness, Gena Rowlands deserves so much of the credit as well. I mean, for being his muse and then for being able to transform herself into this indelible character. You know, it was all, I mean, you probably have heard the true legend, which is that when he wrote it, it was written originally as a play in 3 acts. I mean, everybody thinks everything he did was improvised. That's absolutely not true. Now, what he would do is at the end of a scripted scene, he would just keep the camera. He would never say cut in case the actor wanted to do something. On the set of The Killing of a Chinese Bookie in an underground garage one night where the gangsters are threatening Ben Gazzara's character, Tim Carey being the most menacing of them, after the scripted scene was over, Tim Carey literally, in the most menacing voice you can imagine, sang the entire Star-Spangled Banner as a threat to Gazzara. And so John was, behind the camera on the floor hysterically laughing. He wasn't about to cut it. I mean, that's the relationship John would have with every actor, be it his wife,
right,
or be it with Tim Carey, who was a legendary character actor before John put him in a movie.
Right. I mean, he is an actor. He wasn't one of these guys. He really was able to talk to actors.
That's right.
Actors feel that they feel safe with someone who can speak to them in a way and sort of say, go ahead, go. Play, fly, and he obviously did, and you have, these performances in these movies that just sort of stay with you. They haunt you.
And he didn't want to lose any of it, which is why most of the time, if not all of the time, he shot. And this was all shot in 35mm film. Right. He shot with 2 cameras, and when you consider that he never yelled "cut." It's an expensive little game.
Yeah, they had a lot of runs to the lab.
I was told years later, I was running a company called October Films, and some guy had produced this documentary and wanted to meet with me about it. Turned out he was an assistant camera person on Husbands. And somehow he told me this story about Husbands. And you have to have seen it to really appreciate this story. But one of the pivotal sequences early on in the film, when these 3 friends, their friend dies and they decide to go off on a bender for a weekend for the last time in their lives, it starts in New York, ends up in London, is they go on this drunken night at a bar. And all the regulars are at the bar that they don't know, but they're taunting and playing with them, and they're singing, and they're drunk, and they're vomiting. Anyway, that occurs, I guess, about 20, 30 minutes into the movie. And the guy told me that was the first day of shooting. And Columbia was going to, they had a deal, they were going to distribute the movie. They weren't financing it, but they were going to distribute it. And John had shot between the two cameras that first day 8 hours of footage. And
oh my God.
They went to see dailies the next day.
Even though they weren't financing it.
And John was there. Al Rubin, I think, was there, who was who produced it. Yes. And a guy from Columbia was there, and maybe the cinematographer was there. And they were all in this room, and they literally watched all 8 hours of footage. John's by himself in the front of the screening room. The lights come up, and John's sitting by himself in the front of the theater, still staring at the screen. And he says, "We didn't get it." And the guy from Columbia gets up quietly from his chair, walks over to John and says, "John, I'm going to give you the names and phone numbers of a few guys. They'll help you finance your movie."
And they backed out.
I'm not sure which of the original finance. No, Columbia didn't. They didn't have an upfront production investment in the movie. They were just the distribution.
Gotcha.
They wound up distributing the film. But I mean, this is what John did. And these were not, some of them were members of his team. That's what I discovered working for John in New York, too. He had this cabal of actors who, were struggling their whole lives. These were actors who worked their whole life in New York, on stage, off-Broadway, off-Broadway. And they glommed onto John like he was the second coming, which I believe he was. And people like Red Colors, and people, they were just, you see them all in Husbands. These people, Meade Roberts plays the MC in The Killing of a Chinese Bookie. Meade Roberts wrote the screenplay for Tennessee Williams' The Fugitive Kind, but he was most of his life a struggling screenwriter. And John he was from New York too. And once John, he never let go of you. And I think part of that is because he ingeniously sponged whatever quirky personality you might be able to bring to a character. He wasn't trying to write you, but he would just pick up from people's foibles and from their quirks. And he would infuse all of that into the new characters that he would write in the future. And, part of that is his acting background. And he would, one of these guys who was also in Woman Under the Influence, he was in Husbands, he would show up at the office every day just to say hi. Even when John wasn't there. I mentioned to him one day, I was a huge Rolling Stones fan. The next day, he's friends with gangsters. The next day, he brings in like 2 great Madison Square Garden tickets to see the Stones perform. Oh my God. I mean, this is what life with John was about.
So you two met, obviously, you worked as a distributor for so many years with doing unbelievable films, including My Dinner with Andre and Leigh and Marriage of Maria Braun, and on and on. But when did you both meet?
I met Jeff when you were running Scurus. This is probably 25 years later.
Yeah, it was I started there in 1987, yeah.
And part of what I've always wanted to try and understand is, this is a seminal film, Women Under the Influence, in terms of filmmaking, but also just in terms of the business.
Yeah.
And, part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you was really try and understand what happens in the 10 years in between Women in the Influence and maybe, some other important films, or the 25 years, because I came into a business that had established independent distributors.
Yeah, by 87, for sure. I had already worked for 4 years as head of distribution, VP of distribution for Samuel Goldwyn Films, which before Harvey and Bob Weinstein was the #1 independent distributor, if for no other reason, due to Sam's father's library of films.
That helped, sure. But how does that happen? So, obviously we want to talk about the artistic impact of the film, but I am curious about the business impact of A Woman Under the Influence.
What happened
when you see that success, and John wasn't necessarily able to replicate it, but were other people able to replicate it in some way?
Well, yes. John broke the mold. Money.
Although 1974 was also, I believe, the year of Z, correct?
Z?
Yeah.
Yeah.
These
Or it was
these outsider films that are having a huge impact on the box office.
Well, A Woman Under the Influence was in the mid-'70s.
Right.
Killing of a Chinese Bookie was in the beginning of '76. And what was going on in Hollywood at that time? Remember, we all keep talking about the golden age of American films in the '70s. This was not just Cassavetes. This was Coppola. This was Altman.
Hal Ashby.
And Hal Ashby and Scorsese. And it was the 1970s when Hollywood skipped a beat. And the inmates took over. And they ran with it, but then
Jaws,
and then the model for how then they learned. Oh, thank God we don't have to do this, this parallax view anymore. Now we can go make kid movies again and make a bundle. What everybody forgets about Jaws is that it wasn't so much that Jaws was not just the highest grossing film of all time at that time, but it was the first studio film ever to be released with a national television campaign. Yeah. And that was already the late 70s.
That's right.
Wow.
So
the release pattern was changing.
That was part of Hollywood taking it back from the independents. But that left a void that John had created with A Woman Under the Influence. So all the kids out there who were inspired by John's work, I'll tell you what happened is that after Killing of a Chinese Bookie tanked at the box office, I was offered an opportunity to go back to New York and help distribute Hester Street and Between the Lines, which were directed by Joan Micklin Silver and produced by her husband, Raphael Silver. And because they saw what they called John. When Joan wanted to start making her own films, Ray had the financial means to do it, to finance Hester Street at $350,000 budget or something, and called John, he said, you could talk to Jeff Lipsky.
You do this?
You could talk to people like that. And then Hester Street was an Oscar-nominated film. Carol Kane, Best Actress, and grossed $6 million.
Right, broke the house record at the music hall,
Exactly. And then after that, it was shortly after that I went to work for Dan Talbot, whom I had never heard of because that's how myopic I can be.
Cassavetes. Right?
New Yorker Film, but New Yorker Films was really my foreign film education. I already loved foreign films, but I didn't know foreign films.
Right.
And so but right at that time, a guy named Nathaniel Quit, I believe in '78. See, this is when Hollywood abandoned the Cassavetes again and the Altmans again and the who was the Altman guy, Alan Rudolph, was about to graduate to studio work, and then the studios just abandoned all of that. And it was '78, '79. This guy named Nathaniel Quit had these two guys working for him doing college film sales, I think, named Michael Barker and Tom Bernard.
I think I've heard of them.
and Quit worked for United Artists Pictures. And he kind of saw what Cassavetes had done and what now Ray Silver was doing and said, well, we're a studio. We should be able to do something like this too. And said, I know these two guys who would be interested in doing it. And in 1979, might have been end of '78, that's when United Artists Classics became the first studio specialized division. So that's what kind of bridged the gap.
Oh, that's interesting.
Initially. And their first release, if I'm not wrong, was Francois Truffaut's Le Dernier Métro, The Last Metro. And of course, they're off to the races. When United Artists goes to France to buy a film, they can outbid anybody. They can outbid John Cassavetes. They can outbid Ray Silver. They can outbid any of those
Dan
guys.
Talbot,
When the studios were going the Spielberg and Lucas way, there was a need for producers' reps, who would make, at the time, Martin Scorsese had just done a documentary about the band. And it was going to be distributed by United Artists. But my friend, Blaine Novak, convinced the producer of the film, you're going to get ripped off by the studios. They're not going to do it the right way. It's really more the producer. He talked into it than Scorsese. That led to my seeing the film in a fine cut stage at what was then MGM Studios, now is I guess Sony Studios. So he kind of bridged the gap as a producer's rep and things like that. And then European films, which were in the past relegated to just the top names. All of a sudden in 1978, I had discovered, and that was my first attempt to start a distribution company, and boy, did I fail miserably. I was not an entrepreneur, but in 1978 in Los Angeles at the old film festival called Filmex, I had seen a French film by a first-time director. Her name was Diane Curis, and the movie was called Peppermint Soda, and I was convinced that this film could be a hit in America. And this, Diane, there weren't a lot of Diane Curises in France at the time. There was Godard, there was Truffaut, there were the stars.
Yeah.
There was Bergman in Sweden. You had Fellini, you had De Sica, but you didn't have the new kids on the block like we were starting to see here. And I kind of awkwardly went about trying to start a film distribution company. The irony is, when I went to work at New Yorker Films the following year, Dan Talbot had bought Peppermint Soda.
Right.
And in New York, we opened it and broke a house record, not with a big international superstar name, but with a first-time female director. That's the other thing that happened in the early 80s in terms of distribution, is that sure, there was that golden age of the 70s in Hollywood, but what hadn't been done, there wasn't a lot of glass ceiling breaking in terms of the first, what I call over-the-counter gay film, the first big lesbian film, which I distributed, called Desert Hearts. It was the same year as Parting Glances, which broke the mold for homosexual films, themed films.
Sure.
And so all of those glass ceilings and female directors. Mm-hmm. That wasn't happening in the 70s, but it began happening in the 80s. And that engendered a whole bunch of people with money who wanted to do independent distribution. What got Samuel Goldwyn interested was a guy out of Boston named Larry Jackson. He had made a deal with Warner Brothers. It was called Bugs Bunny Superstar. And it was a feature-length series of Bugs Bunny cartoons and clips, and he distributed it kind of himself in college campuses. And he met Meyer Gottlieb, who was president of Goldwyn at the time, and Sam Goldwyn Jr., and told him, look, and Sam was an Anglophile. So between Larry's interest in independent distribution and Sam liking British films but not knowing what to do with the new ones, his father had produced all these great films. And so he hired Larry to start Samuel Goldwyn Films. And that's how we discovered, it was really Larry, Bill Forsyth. Mm-hmm. And Goldwyn released Gregory's Girl, which was a huge success. So that's how it kind of answers the question. It was a lot of things that took bridging the gap at the end of the 70s when Hollywood shut it down again, and the early 80s, people were still hungry for these kinds of films. There was an audience. There was a hungry audience that John began nurturing when they were in college. Now they were having kids. Now they were professionals. And I'm very buoyant, and I'm very hopeful and optimistic. I don't think the or pre-pandemic audience for the kinds of films that Laemmle Theaters has been playing for more than half a century, that I've been distributing for half a century. I think that audience is both dormant and the potential of ever growing. But I think that, just as this thing began with television in the 1950s, the pandemic did something weird to it, but we just have to navigate the waters.
You got to get past the disruption.
The disruption both of streaming as a new technology and the once a century pandemic, which made everybody. When I was growing up, I was a television addict, and my parents pejoratively shouted at me that I was turning into a couch potato. Now, adults over 40 wear that with a badge of honor that they're couch potatoes. They don't, and it's the whole thing with the internet and phones and blah 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 blah. It's just ruining everything.
But what you said is what you've been saying as well, Greg, in terms of just with great movies in theaters, people come.
Yeah, they do come. Absolutely, and having these films in theaters is important. It's still the best way to see it, but when you don't have the opportunity to see it in a movie theater, it's a great opportunity that people can see things. They can find Goldilocks and the Two Bears, even if it won't play at their local theater.
Sure, but the pandemic and streaming, the other tectonic shift that happened almost at the same time, and it really was a triple whammy, was the impact that all of this had, in addition to some other items that it had on the media. We used to be able to count on massive media support for almost any high caliber, high quality film. They wanted to discover this nobody named Jim Jarmusch in 1984 with this black and white stylistic movie. Yeah. They don't want to discover that today. They want to support the film that won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival this year. They want to support this supposed...
Jim Jarmusch did win the Palme d'Or.
But that's not what they were doing. And it wasn't the Palme d'Or, it was the Camera d'Or.
Okay, sorry.
It was not in the main competition.
Okay,
fair enough. It was in the Cannes or Director's Fortnight. Streaming and how we're dealing with that. It took a while for the studios to openly acknowledge that even for their kinds of movies, we, quote unquote, still need theatrical driver to maximize revenues.
That's right. And the day and date is gone as well.
Exactly. I mean, Apple's different, Netflix is different, and Amazon is different only because that they, they've never had theatrical as their frontline revenue stream. Right. Whereas the studios always did. So it's a little different for them, but in different ways too. And then the other thing is the pandemic. So pandemic, streaming, and media shift. Yeah. So we've had to, been a triple whammy instead of, here's television, or here's cable television, or here's DVDs. This all happened literally, I'd say, within the same 5-year period. And we just have to navigate those waters. The audience is there. It's going to be growing for us. And I'm going to keep making, hopefully, very good movies for that audience.
That's just wonderful. I mean, what you were saying in terms of why we've talked about doing the show is really about, we love movies in theaters and want to support smaller movies. And again, the outlets to be able to kind of get that word out is harder. And so reminding people, connecting those dots, giving people touch points to kind of find these movies, wonderful movies like your movie. This is, let's continue to sort of keep the doors open so that people can find it.
Yeah. And whether the crowds represent a sellout in a theater like this, or whether it's a handful of people in a theater like this, the appreciation that the filmmaker, the feedback, the appreciation that a filmmaker can witness firsthand in environments like this.
It's everything.
I mean, my film played in this very house a few weeks ago, and the crowds were not strong, but the responses by the people who were here it was off the charts positive.
Yes.
And they all commented. I mean, they are loyalists to the Laemmle theater chain. It's not they're loyalists to Jeff Lipsky's film. They know how transformative and how unique an experience can be when they discover something in an environment like that, either with a big crowd or even in a small crowd. It's unbeatable.
Well, we have a small crowd coming in pretty soon. So.
Okay.
We're in a working theater. The matinee's coming in.
Yeah, the matinee show's
Well, that's because it's 8 a.m., right?
Jeff, thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you both.
I
mean, to watch a movie in this environment is a rare privilege, and to sit with you discussing watching a movie in an environment like this is a rare privilege. So I just hope anybody who stumbles on this little conversation, that the first thing they do is open their print newspaper or go online and find out what's playing here, because I guarantee it's going to be an eye-opening delight.
Well, whether it's here or an art house anywhere across the country, and there's fabulous art houses in almost every community.
Absolutely.
Come see a movie inside the art house.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jeff, thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Inside the Art House was produced by Miles McCreary, Thomas Cassetta, and Raphael Sparge, and our on-site producer is Norrin Dickerson, and filmed at the Laemmle Royal Theatre. The episode was edited by Gabriel Laemmle, show open edited by Rick Pratt, music by Isabel Engman and Gerardo Garcia Jr., graphics by Janet DeAngelis, marketing by Stephanie Peters and Matthew King. Find out more at InsideTheArtHouse.com.